everything can really be summed up from the idea that their strategic intent is designed to enhance CMMC in version 2.0 in these sort of 8 broad ways. And the first one that's the most apparent is their focus on the standards and the third-party assessments as to where they're going to be applying those capabilities. And as we said before, this is companies that are managing information deemed critical to national security. Now, the mechanism for determining whether something is deemed, information critical to national security has yet to be determined. I know there's some theories flying around out there, and I'm sure people are very interested to hear what the thoughts are. We don't really have the time to speculate on that, but the idea that they would be focusing on a more critical form of information that they know for some reason that also happens to be CUI. I mean, that's also what everybody was sort of clamoring for. I mean, to have some sort of prioritization from a strategic perspective as to what they were going to be focused on. So I think for all intents and purposes, focusing on that type of information is highly beneficial. And so
I agree, but it's going to be nice to know what criteria they're going to use to decide what information is impactful or not.
Right. Yeah, absolutely.
If all we have is the introduction of another consequential definition that isn't in fact well defined or doesn't have a place in the CUI, rule, well, I mean, you're sort of, layering uncertainty upon confusion. One thing that wasn't, here, and some of us had hoped for, is that we would finally get some clarification as to just what DoD's role will be in telling people what is the information that you have to protect, CUI or otherwise. Right. And some of us had hoped that we would see evidence that we might get a modernization of the NARA CUI rule of 32 CFR. Haven't heard it.
Yeah, I'm still hoping for Christmas.
We're starting to run short on time here, guys, so we need to start moving through these pretty expeditiously.
Right. So the big theme here on these 8 categories is a focus on that information, as well as the upstream, sort of prime companies that are running critical programs. Beyond the focus on that information is providing clarity. So that's another element that they've talked about in terms of providing clarity on the standards and simplifying the requirements. Now, they've done this by removing elements on the next slide, this graphic that everyone has seen, by removing elements that were just sort of added by CMMC that don't actually change the underlying requirements, to Bob's point earlier, that anybody had beforehand, before CMMC 1.0. It is really just reinforcing the fact that they are returning to those same underlying requirements in CMMC 2.0. Structurally, really the only question is everyone now is going to have to do these self-assessments either through 7019 and 7020 or now under this idea of the CMMC program. The only question is really who is going to come and assess you and perhaps when, because as we know, the data flow for that information is going to be the same for the folks who needed the assessments beforehand as it is now. The folks who were going to be level 1 beforehand were always going to be level 1. So if you're still inside the wire of needing those assessments, really not a lot has changed. So, they move on in those next sections after they talk about streamlining and everything. They say they want to align the requirements to NIST standards. So the new level 2 is equivalent to 800-171. They've removed the maturity processes. They've removed the unique practices. And level 3 will be set up for a subset of NIST 800-172, which in and of itself builds off of the controls in 800-171. So we've said this before, we'll say it again. All of the relevant clauses that we talk about, 7012, 1920, 21 for CMMC 1.0, now for CMMC 2.0, 800-172, all of these programs and approaches and assessments and whoever it happens to be revolves around the same underlying requirement. And all of the changes that we've seen in CMMC 2.0 actually reinforce the fact that the underlying requirements in 800-171 have not changed. Quick note on the fact that they've eliminated the maturity processes. We have a longer amount of information on this coming out in the future, is the fact that those maturity processes don't really go away if you were previously a level 3 company under CMMC 1.0. They specified that you needed policies, but during an assessment, a lot of those things that they specified will still be asked for because they were assumed to exist. So this doesn't really count for the folks who were at the lower levels in the previous CMMC 1.0. But if you're still a company that's going to need to do an assessment for CUI and 800-171, the elimination of maturity processes is not as clear as they indicate it to be.
Yeah, and we see some questions in here about, talk about the Delta 20 controls, the additional controls that were removed, the CMMC specific or unique controls that we talked about, we've been talking about. That's what I'm going to address here in just a few minutes. So hold on to those questions, and we'll get to some of that here in a minute.
Yeah, absolutely. We have those categorized here at the end. So, they've, like I said, reinforced the fact that they are returning to those underlying requirements. And all along under CMMC 1.0, the phrase that I always use was they were just a reskin of those underlying requirements. So when they remove anything that was added by CMMC, your underlying requirements never really changed. And we all know how problematic that was whenever the government would tell people, you ought to have already been doing this. None of our cost estimates are based off of the previously existing underlying requirements. So when you get to the next element of these 8 things that are modifying and enhancing CMMC, when they say we're reducing costs, when they say we're reducing barriers to entry, that is from a program level, because now everybody at level 1 is going to be doing self-assessments, and that's going to save a lot of money from the program perspective. Level 2 no longer exists, so all those estimates go out the window. Level 4 under CMMC 1.0 is gone, so all those elements go out the window. And the new level 3 is going to be conducted by government-led teams, which probably won't cost as much as the existing sort of third-party assessments. So that's going to reduce the cost. So from the government's perspective, they're massively reducing the cost of CMMC. But if you are still in that group of people, of which there will be a significant number of companies receiving this information that needs an external third-party assessment, they have included language that has said that it will still be up to market forces based on the complexity of your network. And so you're still going to have the same issue of assessment cost under CMMC 2.0 that you did under CMMC 1.0, because when they say cost savings, they're not talking about the folks who are receiving external third-party assessments. Now, when these Oh, sorry. So just a quick note there. When they say, we're going to release cost estimates, we're going to release cost estimates for each level, we all know what they said in the previous interim rule. Since it's been assumed that you already had 800.171 fully implemented, all of the cost estimates were done for the new things in CMMC. They have said they've removed those new things. They've returned and synced everything up back to those underlying requirements. So what cost estimate for implementation do you think that they're really going to have? Most of those cost estimates will probably be related to the new CMMC level 3 rather than for 800.171. And I think that's probably going to upset quite a few people when those cost estimates come out, because they're going to wave the flag of cost savings. Now, they've even said...
Yeah, just to say, Jacob, the reason they're doing that is because basically they're going to say that all of the costs for the implementation of all these practices and controls were all assumed as part of DFARS 7012, which you've had in your contract since 2017, 2018.
Exactly.
So there is no additional cost. You just have to do what you've been signing up to do for the last 3-4 years.
That's right. And so because of that, because of the fact that everyone had attributed the overall cost burden with CMMC specifically, now that CMMC 1.0 is dead and we have CMMC 2.0, which is just the underlying requirements, your cost burden has not really changed all that much, which we'll get to in the categorization of the Delta 20 here in a little bit. They say, the self-assessments are going to be conducted in accordance with assessment guides and scoping guides that are supposed to come out by the end of this month. Everything's going to be uploaded to SPRS. I mean, we're familiar with all of these processes, but for the folks that still need, this is a key point, for the folks that still need an external third-party assessment, there is no indication. They have, in fact, sort of preemptively said that those will still be the same style and cost of assessment. So when they say reduce cost, reduce barrier to entry, if you still need that assessment, they aren't necessarily talking about you. Furthermore, on the next, after they get away from this sort of cost reduction, and just sort of quickly, I know we're short on time, but it was always funny whenever they created 171, because previously, before 171, they prescribed controls directly out of 853. When they gave everybody 171 and they reduced the controls, what did they say in the rulemaking? They said, we saved everybody time we saved everybody burden because we reduced things down. Here, they're doing the same thing, but you still have 800-171. So that reductions in savings doesn't really mean a whole lot. Now, they say they're still going to utilize assessments for assurance and accountability. The third part, this is the part that everybody's been familiar with. The third-party assessments are going to a subset based off of data identity. Like we talked about before, the DoD has never been very good about their data governance or identification. So we're yet to see how they will handle that or determine criticality. But like I said, CMMC cost assessment costs are going to be a factor of the same things that they were a factor of under CMMC 1.0. They spend a lot of time talking about trust in the ecosystem, which is highly focused on how the AB is run, who is on the AB, what that relationship is, how it's operated. For the folks that have underlying 800-171 requirements and the need for an external assessment, like I said, at the end of the day, if it's a third-party assessment that you have to undergo because of the nature of the data, this is not the time to think that your requirements have been alleviated. It really doesn't. If you end up paying for it, or if the government ends up paying for it, I mean, obviously, we would rather have these costs subsidized. But from an architectural perspective, from an investment perspective, from a compliance obligation perspective, the underlying requirements have not changed. When they go, even when they talk about, the last few points where they talk about flexibility and speed through the waiver and POAM process, they say that they're doing these in the spirit of collaboration, right? They're fostering a new sense of collaboration. But based off what we've been told about the plans of actions that are allowed, the most costly and critical controls that would typically be put on a plan of action probably won't be allowed if by highest weighted, they're talking about the obligations under 70-19 and 70-20 assessment scoring. And the baseline number of controls will still be prescribed that you'll have to implement. So yes, there's POAMs, and this is great. They listened. This is what everybody wanted, but it's not exactly what everybody wanted. And it's certainly, after what we heard last night, if it's limited to 6 months, that's really not what I think people wanted when they said we want a POAM. Even on the idea of having increased speed based off waivers, that basically sounds like a very difficult process to go through. And it's for the entirety of the waiver process. So I would imagine that they will be highly selective about just waiving people out of those requirements based off of the critical data that you're holding. So overall, based off what we know from the news, your underlying requirements have not changed. I think, Bob, you got to...
super quick comment. In my job as a lawyer, I have dealt with waiver authority under various statutes. It's really hard to get. Right. It really isn't relevant to anybody on a day-to-day basis. And it's really not your problem. Waiver authority has got to be requested by the program officer, the requiring activity. Just put it aside. And as to the POAMs, that would not be a smart move to assume that you're going to get a POAM as to what you want or when you need it or where. I don't think so. I went back and looked at the DoD assessment guide at those items that get 5 points, meaning the really important ones. And I understand what they said last night to be that we're not going to let you get a POAM on any of those high value items. There are a lot of them, and they are really central. They are the basic requirements of 171 versus the derived. There could be, incidents and aspects. 43?
I believe it's 43, yeah.
Right. In other words, they're sure. I mean, it might be that on certain particular aspects and applications you could get a POAM, but the core is still there, and POAMs should not be relied upon, and DoD doesn't want to encourage them. A POAM can become a license to not finish or not do it, and that's not in DoD's interest.